we'll get started with Sachin. So Sachin, you are our esteemed guest today. I would love for you to do a quick introduction about yourself and why you're qualified to talk about this topic of finding product market fit.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm currently the founder and CEO of Notejoy, which is a collaborative notes app for individuals and teams. I've also worked with Reforge now on two different programs, the Mastering Product Management program, which is all about helping product managers go from good to great by helping them learn the different tools of the trade. And this new program that we're launching in the fall called Finding Product Market Fit. And, my experience with product market fit really comes from what I call my 500.
You muted yourself, Sachin, in the middle of that. You're gonna,
All right. So I was saying that, I kind of come to this topic of finding product market fit from my own 5 hunts for product market fit. And so I've actually worked on new product innovation now, both at 3 startups that I've co-founded, Anywhere.fm, Connected, and Notejoy. So really going from 0 to 1 as a startup founder myself, but then also building 0 to 1 products at large established companies like Microsoft and LinkedIn. I've had the opportunity to build a new version of Visual Studio designed for database professionals, as well as incubate and launch LinkedIn Sales Navigator, a premium subscription for sales professionals that has now gone on to generate over $1 billion in sales for LinkedIn and Microsoft. And so, yeah, that's sort of my background and what brings me to this topic of finding product market fit.
Excellent. So let's just jump into questions. We have a couple of great questions from the audience that I will kick off in a second, but I want to just set the stage here. You recently published a controversial take on a methodology called Lean Startup that I think a lot of people are familiar with about how to find product market fit. And you called into question its usefulness as a guide to product market fit discovery. Why did you think it was so important to single out the Lean Startup methodology? And what do you think the foundational problems or ways your approach is different than that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I want to start out by saying there was a lot of good things that the Lean methodology brought forward compared to the past. Namely, this idea that before Lean, what did we do? We did these elaborate business plans with these kind of useless projections. And the idea that the Lean Startup moved us away from that is great. The other thing is we used to have these long product development cycles before we ever talked to customers. Again, that was a form of waste. And so what I love about Lean is this idea that it enabled us to do customer discovery and to ship faster. And so those ideas are great. Now, the thing about Lean is that it's a methodology that was first introduced 14 years ago, right? And there's a lot that we have learned about how to find product market fit more effectively. And the reason I felt like we had to call out some of the challenges of this methodology is that people still rely on it and as their sort of #1 playbook. And so some of the things that we've learned about Lean, that Lean sort of glosses over, is this idea that you want to start with a thoughtful plan. I think some people take Lean methodology to an extreme and sort of see it as this way of doing agnostic experimentation. All we need to do is launch more and more successive MVPs and we'll iterate our way to success. But actually, the best entrepreneurs are very thoughtful about their product strategy up front. And so that's one thing that sort of Lean glosses over. Another is this idea that it turns out we've learned there's so many validation techniques out there beyond just MVPs. MVPs are great, but there's other ways that we can faster and more cheaply validate our ideas beyond this idea of building an MVP. It also turns out that Lean doesn't talk to us much about how do we even know whether we have PMF or not. And it turns out many startups fail because they prematurely scale. They think they have PMF, but they don't. And so we want to be thoughtful about measuring PMF effectively. And finally, I'd say Lean doesn't really talk much about the whole focus on user growth and having a deliberate focus on user growth. And that's so critical for startups to get off the ground. And so the reason I sort of published that essay was to get the word out that, hey, Lean has its limitations and start to share some of the best practices that we've learned in the subsequent 14 years on how to build products, how to iterate to product market fit even faster than what Lean allowed us to do before.
That's great. For those of you who maybe haven't read the post, Sachin, why don't you give a quick overview of what you've sort of coined as your name for this, for a different methodology. And you've talked about some of the main differences, but what are sort of the big steps to building a startup and building a new product in the way that you've described it?
Yeah, so I call the new methodology the deliberate startup. And so the idea is that we feel as if there's ways that you can be more deliberate upfront on some of these aspects of your business that will enable you to speed your path and increases your chances of finding product market fit. Obviously, startups are one of these things that are incredibly difficult, and I'm not trying to overpromise and oversell that I'm going to somehow help you with this methodology ultimately find product market fit, but we do feel it will increase your odds and chances of doing so. And so when we think about this, we think about the idea of the deliberate startup in 4 key steps, what we call the PMF loop, or the product market fit loop. And you start by defining your product strategy. Let's upfront take a moment to define the specific product strategy that we want to build. And we create a document called the PMF narrative to capture our product market fit hypotheses. We then start validating our hypotheses, and that's that second phase of validation. And we encourage you to start with your riskiest hypotheses once you've determined what those are and to validate those. Third, we get into how do you measure PMF with very prescriptive guidance on metrics that you can use to measure whether you have PMF, and more importantly, what to do about it when you may not have PMF yet. And finally, 4 is growing users. How do we come up with a thoughtful approach to actually growing not only our initial set of users to get some initial traction, but ultimately to create a sustainable path to new user growth? And those 4 phases sort of make up the deliberate startup PMF loop that we spend a lot of time talking about and believe really sort of will increase our odds of getting us to the promised land of product market fit.
Awesome. So another concept that you and I have talked about a bunch is this idea of exploring the idea maze. And can you share like what is important about this idea? What's important about it? What is it and why is it important? And how do you think about the idea maze? What recommendations do you have for people who are at the earliest stages of trying to discover new products?
Yeah, so this concept of the idea maze came from Balaji Srinivasan, formerly of Andreessen Horowitz and Coinbase. And he kind of coined this term to kind of represent what he saw, and many people agree with, as sort of the best practice. This idea that the best entrepreneurs deeply explore the idea maze. And what he meant by that is like when you think about a startup idea, you're on this hunt to try to find the promised land. And it's sort of like this maze where you have so many different directions you can go into. Many of those directions lead to dead ends, but some of them lead to success. And so as entrepreneurs, we have to sort of explore all the potential paths that our startup can go down to be successful. Now, how do you do that? And so he talks about having understood all the players in the market, understanding the history of that market, understanding what ultimately caused the past failures to fail in that market, and what new technologies could you bring to bear that ultimately would make you successful and enable entirely new possibilities in the market that you're in. And so what's interesting about this concept is that many actual entrepreneurs consider it a best practice, but in some ways it's sort of anti-lean because we're talking about upfront doing market research, doing sort of this exploration of where the best paths are. Instead, what lean would tell us to do is focus purely on customer discovery and launching MVPs. And so I think this is where we need better best practices. If we agree this idea maze concept is great, how do we actually go do it? And so we talk a lot about in the deliberate startup methodology, it's this idea that you start with a specific product strategy. And we boil a product strategy down to 6 key dimensions: the problem that you're solving for your customer, the target audience that you're actually going after, the value proposition that you're delivering to them. This is what your solution ultimately is, what your competitive advantage is and how you're going to win against the competition. ultimately how you're going to grow, your growth strategy, and finally, how you're going to make money, your business model. And we believe a product strategy requires those 6 dimensions to be complete. Why? Because we found that startups most commonly fail because they fail on one of those 6 dimensions. They might not have come up with a acute enough problem to solve. They might not have been able to figure out how do they grow their users. And so it's paramount to figure out those 6. And of course, when you start, all you have is guesses. And it's then the work of doing customer interviews, market research, seeking expert advice. That's the exploration of the idea maze that ultimately helps you come up with a better strategy. And of course, you'll eventually start building MVPs to go after it. But Mark Andreessen likes to say the best entrepreneurs that we fund are ones that have thoroughly and deeply explored the idea maze well before they built a robust product. And so that's sort of this concept that I'm a huge believer in. And I think we need to bring a little bit of discipline and process around how do you actually go do that.
Yeah, it seems like that can be very daunting. Like the whole idea maze is basically infinite, like the possible number of things. Like if I do this, then it has this consequence, et cetera. I like to think of it as like you need enough to get started, not enough to get finished, if that makes sense, as a place to start when you're thinking about strategy work. Like it's a lot like writing a product requirements document. I don't need every single requirement so that I can build a finished product out of it, but do I have enough information to get started? So let's move on to the next step, which is like, okay, you've explored the idea maze, you have an understanding of the market, you have a basic understanding or hypotheses about your customer. I think this is where a lot of the lean startup stuff has actually been very interesting, is in this next step. Steve Blank, who wrote the book 4 Steps to the Epiphany and is sort of the originator of lean startup, along with Eric Ries, wrote, one of his big contributions was the concept of customer development, right? Getting out of the building, talking to customers in order to inform this product idea that you may have developed through this idea maze. It seems simple and obvious, but what do great practitioners still get wrong today about customer development? Where do you see this step failing, where people sort of like don't see the forest through the trees on this?
Yeah, you know, customer development and customer discovery is so important. And like, we clearly need to be doing this, getting out of our 4 walls, talking to customers and getting their input. And so I think everyone agrees that is paramount in the earliest stages of a startup. Now, the question is, how do you do it and how do you do it well? And I think what's interesting is there's 2 big challenges I see many teams that are doing customer discovery struggle with. The first one is a very unfortunate one, but a very common one. It's this idea of confirmation bias. And what it is that you go out to talk to customers, you already have a hypothesis for what your product is going to be, and you sort of don't listen carefully enough to that customer feedback, and instead you hear what you want to hear, which is great. They're confirming my ideas. They're confirming what I already know. And part of the reason this happens is because of human nature. If I ask you, hey, is this interesting? Do you like this? Humans like to be liked. Of course, you're going to get some nods from me. I'm like, yeah, that's interesting. That's cool when you're talking to me. And what we fail to do is ask the questions in such a way that we can be truth seeking, that we can get real signal that can actually enable us to really understand if we're on the right path or not. And so when we talk about doing these customer interviews, we have to be really thoughtful about the process in which how we ask the questions to ensure we're truth seeking. Let me give you an example of how we do this and how we talk about this in the program. We talk about this idea of how do you make sure they're giving you real signal? If you just ask them, is this interesting? Would you use this? You're going to get a weak signal. But let's take one dimension specifically, problem to solve. How do you figure out whether the problem that you're asking them about is acute enough? What I like to ask is a 2-parted question. The first is, when you think about your role or you think about this area, what are the top 3 problems that you struggle with in this space, right? And so you ask them unaided. You're not presupposing anything. You ask them what these 3 problems are. And then you go and ask them, okay, here's the problem we're thinking about solving. Now, where does that fall in your stack rank of prioritized problems? Is it at the top of the list? Is it at the middle of the list? Or is it at the bottom of the list of problems you already told us about, right? Now, let me tell you, If you talk to 5 people and they all put it at the bottom of the list, you have a vitamin, not a painkiller. And here's the thing, each customer will have their own reason for why it's at the bottom of the list. They'll be like, hey, look, we have these other priorities that are really important right now. And you might think you're hearing an anecdote specific to that company. But the point is, once you have 3 to 5 customers telling you at the bottom of the list, you have not found an acute enough problem. And this is an example of asking the question in a way that you can actually really solve for getting signal as opposed to struggling with this confirmation bias problem. The second part I'll mention here is another issue people often have is like, hey, look, I talked to 5 customers and I got 5 different answers. What do I do with that in terms of figuring out which direction to take? And so the thing that we often talk about is the key thing you need to understand is how do you pattern match across customers by deeply understanding the customer segments that each customer falls into. And so here's the key. What you're looking for is, hey, while you got different responses, maybe you'll hear 2 to 3 people that fall into the same customer segment. And what are the commonalities amongst them? And maybe that can argue, okay, maybe we should focus on that customer segment to go after. And so that requires you, when you talk to someone, to start with deeply understanding who they are, their demographics, their firmographics, their psychographics. So then you can, after the fact, pattern match and figure out what subtleties exist within them as a customer segment for which your solution might or might not be resonating.
Awesome. It's funny, as you said that, the number of times that new founders or product builders have come to me as a customer and asked, what do you think about this product? And I say, yeah, that's important, but it's not really like the thing we're working on now, but might be valuable later. And when I look back at that, I'm almost always trying to not say your product is not useful to me. I'm trying to be helpful. And I think people want to do that. They want to be helpful. It is on their list, but if it's not at the top, I'm not going to buy something today, right? I think that's a really good insight. Let's move to the next step. So let's say we're going fast through this. Obviously, there's a lot more to each of these pieces. But the next part is sort of, okay, let's say I've validated the problem. I understand that it's at the top of someone's list. I understand who my target customer segments are. That maps with my strategy that I built out. Now it's time to build. It's time to actually build something and validate that my solution solves that problem. How do you think about the right ways to validate product ideas? Is it go and build something? Is it show them a paper prototype? What are the different methods to solving the problem of, I know there's a problem, is my solution a solution to that?
Yeah, great question. All about validation techniques. So I think there's 2 key pieces here. First is what to validate, and second is how to validate it, right? And so I think when I think about this, the first step is all about figuring out what's the most important thing in our product strategy to validate. And so this is where I think it's actually helpful, since we started with this idea of a product strategy has these 6 dimensions, we can then ask ourselves, which of these dimensions do we feel is the riskiest, the most unknown, the area that we have the least conviction? And I find guiding our validation efforts based on what is our riskiest hypothesis is a great way to think about what validation work should we be doing next. And so I think you need to think about what is that riskiest dimension. Now, how do you figure out what is your riskiest dimension? I think there's a couple of ways to do that. First, of course, you talk internally to figure out internally what do you believe is your riskiest dimension. But these broad-based validation techniques around customer interviews, market research, and talking to expert advice, by doing those, we're getting evidence points across all of our 6 dimensions of our product strategy, right? Someone might tell you, oh, this is a really acute problem, or hey, I think your value proposition is very compelling here. And so you can add up those evidence points to then look at, where do we have the least conviction? Which of these dimensions do we have the least proof on? Or are we even hearing negative feedback on? And so that should help guide you to figure out what those riskiest dimensions are. Now, once you identify what your riskiest assumption is, it's then important to figure out what actual validation technique helps to validate it. Now, here's the challenge with MVPs, which is the common thing that people jump to when they think about validation. Minimum viable products are great for validating your value proposition. but they're actually not so great for validating other dimensions of your product strategy. If your issue is the problem acute enough, and you're concerned about, is this problem a key thing, actually doing all the effort to go build the product just to figure out, do you have an acute enough problem, is a huge waste of effort and really doesn't even validate the thing that you sought to validate. Someone might give you feedback on the product, but not give you feedback on whether this is a problem worth solving for them. For another example is, let's say your business model is your big risk. Here's the challenge. A lot of people who ultimately build MVPs give their MVPs away for free and aren't thinking about whether it actually answers that question of your business model. In that case, you could use alternative techniques like pre-sales to actually figure out whether you can solve that business problem. Is there willingness to pay? Are people willing to pay for a solution like this? And so we talk about in the program the sort of portfolio of validation techniques, anywhere from surveys to customer interviews to prototypes to pre-sales to product tests and growth tests. And we help you figure out which one to apply depending on what your riskiest hypothesis is and what dimension that falls into. And so I think this is the nuance that we've learned over time, that it's not just about how do I launch a product as quickly as possible. It's about identifying your riskiest hypothesis, picking the validation technique that will let you validate that hypothesis, and then reevaluating what's my new riskiest hypothesis and where should I go from there.
Awesome. We have a lot of folks on the call, and I want to make sure we have enough time for a lot of good participant questions. So I'm just going to ask one more sort of canned upfront question, which is, I think we're going to skip the hard part, which is how do I know I have product market fit? Save that for the program. That's a deep topic we'll spend some time on. But I want to talk about early user growth. I think a lot of people think about building a product as just building the right product, finding a few customers, but growth is really a huge part of the equation about whether a product can be successful. Paul Graham, who is the founder of Y Combinator, famously wrote about doing things that don't scale, like manually recruiting early users. I'm curious how you think about do you believe this is the right approach, and how do you know when the right time is to figure out what the ultimate growth strategy of a company can be? Because you can't do things that don't scale forever.
Yeah, it's one of these interesting things that I think we've learned, that ultimately the best practice is this two-prong approach. You start with recruiting customers manually in your early traction phase, and then ultimately you work on building a more sustainable growth loop. And the idea here is that early on, when you're trying to recruit those early customers, you need to handhold them to convince them to try your product, right? This is everything from leveraging your professional network to recruit those early customers. It's things like leveraging existing communities. Maybe you'll find a passionate set of users in Reddit or in other online communities where you can leverage that to actually get them into your product. Or it's things like targeting very specific influencers in the space that you're in to find those visionary customers. And this is so important because manually recruiting them is critical when you're trying to convince them to use a product that hasn't existed before. You're trying to convince them to trust you when, frankly, your company has very little credibility. And so that manual recruitment step can't be skipped. That if you attempt to go to scalable growth channels, you will often fail at getting those early customers because the manual steps are required to get those visionary customers in. Now, ultimately, you do need to move to more scalable channels. And actually, one of the failure points is people never sort of move to scalable channels. And that's because these traction channels I just talked about are limited in scale. You can only get so many people from your personal network. You can only find so many people in passionate online communities, for example. And so you need to move to scalable channels. And at that point, you really want to be using this concept we talk a lot about Reforge, this concept of growth loops, which are these sustainable user acquisition channels that are self-reinforcing. By virtue of adding a cohort of users, that growth loop will ultimately bring in the next cohort of users. And we talk a lot about at Reforge this concept of viral loops, content loops, and paid loops. Now, the key thing is staging this. You got to figure out at what point it makes sense for you to start moving on to identifying which growth loop will work for you, starting to run some few tests around those growth loops and building those channels once you've gotten that initial set of traction from manually recruiting users. And it's sort of this transition where you're going from initially all of these linear tactics, these traction channels, to starting to experiment with some growth loops, and then ultimately, hopefully, getting the vast majority of your acquisition from sustainable growth loops. And so that's how to think about kind of making that transition happen.
Awesome. Okay, I am unmuted. That is a great answer. The way I like to think about it is, while I don't need to build sustainable growth loops when I'm first launching a product, I should probably have a good idea of which ones might work so that I have the right channel product fit or channel business model fit. A lot of you have figured it out. Raise your hand in Zoom if you have a question. I'm going to do my best to go quickly through these so that we get great answers from Sachin. The thing I would ask is just try to be concise, and a great question ends with a question mark. So if you could, focus your questions, that would be great so we can get through as many of these as possible. We'll start with Mike. Go ahead. Unmute and go ahead.
Hello all. Hi, Sachin. Thank you for the presentation. So I just have a short question. Could you please shortly clarify what's actually really specific about this deliberate startup method? Because from first sight, I cannot sort of pinpoint where's the difference between this method and sort of lean approach, mom test, design thinking, sort of prototyping, customer development, etc. Validating the risk as hypothesis, etc. These things sort of all come in one place when you think about the lean method, and I have trouble understanding what's different about the deliberate methodology, or what's there exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk a little bit more about this. So let me talk about kind of the 4 steps where we talked about in that PMF loop. The first is this whole idea of starting up front by defining your product strategy. And so what we have you do in the deliberate startup methodology is put together a 1 to 2 page PMF narrative document that outlines your best guess up front on each of these 6 dimensions: your target audience, the problem you're solving, the competitive advantage, your growth strategy, and your business model. And in the program, we detail how do you actually come up with your initial target audience by going through an exercise of customer attributes, collecting those customer attributes to come up with customer segments. We also talk about how do you come up with both your short-term and long-term competitive advantage and where competitive advantage comes from. So that's this first step around strategy, which Lean is actually quite light on, and encourages you, hey, you're going to ultimately figure it out through experimentation. And we're saying, no, actually, you should be thoughtful up front and deliberate around that process. So that's step 1. Step 2, when it comes to validation techniques, it's what I described. We actually help you identify the riskiest hypothesis through a set of broad-based validation techniques, which are customer interviews, market research, and expert advice. And then we help you pick, and we actually show you the most common targeted validation techniques, which dimensions they're really good at validating, and then helping you pick that specific validation technique, right? And so Lean is much more amorphous about saying an MVP could be anything, but we're now saying specifically what we think you should go after in terms of your validation technique. On measuring, we come up with very specific metrics around growth and retention for measuring, as opposed to using alternatives like PMF surveys and NPS surveys, or relying on your gut or a feeling. And finally, on growing users, we talk a lot about establishing your initial traction through traction channels, and we list the 5 most common traction channels, and then ultimately establishing your growth loop through the 3 growth loops we talked about. So that's a very quick way of going through a lot of the course content, but trying to highlight the parts that we think are more concrete than you'll get from Lean today.
Yeah, I think the way I like to think about it is, on one end, you have Lean, which is all about experimentation, starting with the smallest thing possible. On the other end, you have people like Keith Raboy and others who talk about the fat startup. Like, hey, you got to write the script, build the movie, sell the tickets, that it's all about intuition up front. And I think what we're sort of saying is that it depends on what product you're building, and there are different approaches and both are right. But what is right about which ones, you know, a lot of like frameworks that we build at Reforge are really come down to it depends type questions. And this is about mapping the different types of products, markets, and ideas to the right methodologies and helping you get really specific about solving problems in a less dogmatic way and a more systematic way. So we had some great questions about founder intuition, et cetera. We want to bring all of those different pieces into the puzzle. I'm going to try and now I'm breaking my own rule and answering questions in a long-winded way. Let's move to Harsha. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, Sachin. Good to meet you. I posted a few questions on a Slack channel, the program channel, but one of them is a burning question for me, and allow me to read it out verbatim. Is product market fit a synergistic aggregate of feature market fits? So what I mean by that is, in going towards a product, getting product market fit, have the features themselves go to match something, solve a problem, and all of them come together automatically, and then the product becomes this thing. So I'm trying to understand what are the patterns for products that really have achieved product market fit, and how to trace it back to the individual features and value propositions.
Yeah, it's a great question. What I'd say is that your capabilities in how you solve your value proposition, which ultimately instantiate as a feature, can ultimately be the thing that brings you to product market fit, but rarely is it the addition of features, the cumulative value of features that somehow get you to product market fit when you don't have it. So let me give you a great case study on this really quickly. Andy Johns was an early leader at Wealthfront, and he talks a lot about this, that initially they created this service that automatically invested money for you. So you didn't have to think about which mutual funds to put them in, how to rebalance them, and things like that. It would do that work for you. They initially launched this product, and actually they didn't have product market fit initially. They were adding a bunch of features to make it more attractive, and it wasn't increasing their product market fit much. Eventually, they launched this feature called tax loss harvesting. And the concept was that it took this esoteric tool that was only accessible to people who are high net worth, think 10 million plus in net worth, and brought it to people if even they only had a couple $100,000 to invest. Adding that one feature ultimately did bring them to product market fit, because now they had something that people valued and thought was very unique relative to what they could do themselves. And yes, it's that feature capability that got them there, but it wasn't the addition of features, it was that individual feature that ultimately got them there. So I don't think you can think about this as an additive thing, that somehow when you add more features, you're going to get there, but there may be a killer feature that gets you to PMF.
I love that. It's not the sum of the parts, but usually one thing that drives it. And I think that's a really important point. Danielle, why don't you go next?
Hi, Sachin. Thank you. I pivoted a few years ago from helping tech startups scale for growth into helping climate tech startups and impact tech and B Corps. So often the mission is based on like SDGs goals. So there's sort of global UN goals. And it's not always at the top of a business priority list or a person's priority list. I'm interested to know how you would approach that when developing product market fit, and whether you think the deliberate startup methodology covers sort of impact growth as opposed to just sort of revenue growth.
Yeah, great question. So I think this comes down to ultimately you are building a product that needs to solve problems for that target customer, right? It's a different class of problems. It might not be revenue growth, but a different class of problems that ultimately they care about. And so I think you definitely can leverage this methodology. You just have to get smart about how do you frame the area in which that you're in that can get to is this an important way for solving it for that set of customers, right? And so, for example, we talk a lot about this even for Reforge, where, the mission of Reforge is all about kind of helping you to accelerate your career through additional learning. And so when you're going to a company and you're not just asking them about what's their overall problems, but when it comes to learning and development, really understanding the set of problems in that space. And so I think you can still use, for example, the customer discovery uniques we're talking about, but you have to narrow in the space that you're talking about to be relevant for that specific problem space that these companies are solving for.
I think that's an awesome question and not one I had thought of, but it's the same, like, hey, in the category we're talking about, let's make sure we're still solving the most burning problem. Sorry, I shouldn't have said burning problem, but the most important problem in the space of impact-driven things versus just would-be nices. I think that's great advice. We got to move fast. Yu-Ting, go ahead.
Hi everyone. Question is pretty simple. What's the goal of strategy? What's the difference between strategy and marketing? It seems like
sorry, your mic is a little soft and I can't exactly hear you. If you don't mind, like moving it a little closer.
What's the goal of go-to-market strategy? What's the difference between go-to-market strategy and marketing? Seems like a lot of what we are talking about is go-to-market, so maybe I'm not understanding it.
Yeah, so I think I'll summarize just in case other people couldn't hear it. What is the difference between how are we thinking about go-to-market strategy versus our overall marketing strategy, and how does that play into this? Is that really what we're talking about here when we're talking about building product market fit for a product? Is that correct?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, so I think we talk about strategy here in a couple of different ways. The overall thing we've been talking about is product strategy, which is how do you think about across these 6 dimensions of your business, how your company is going to win in the market that they're playing in. Now, when we specifically talk about one of those dimensions, we talk about growth strategy, which is analogous to your go-to-market strategy, to your marketing strategy. How are you going to bring this product to market in such a way that it's going to attract the exact target audience that you're going after? And of course, there's many ways to think about doing that. And that's specifically in the growth strategy part. But we believe the product strategy is more all-encompassing into all the dimensions that matter for your product to ultimately be successful.
All right, great. Veronica.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much, Sachin and Reforge, for this amazing content. So I'm glad you talk about the discovering phase of customers. That's a very difficult space, and I'm glad to say that I'm the Spanish translator of the Mom Test book. So the Mom Test book written by Rob Fitzpatrick, an amazing tool for entrepreneurs. I've been teaching this Mom Test book for over 10 years in startups, together with Lean Startup and so on. So I'm very grateful for your intervention. And my question is about measuring product market fit, and so what can you tell us more about the fact that maybe different types of business models have different metrics, or is that the difficulty? Or so in that case, when you have a business model, let's say an e-commerce, a marketplace, are SaaS, software as a service, all those have different metrics. So how still do you know that you have reached product market fit? I think this is super challenging for us as entrepreneurs.
Yeah, great question. How do you actually measure product market fit? And so, what I'll tell you is that our belief is it's not just a feeling that you always know when you have product market fit. In fact, it can be actually very uncertain. And in fact, what happens is one of the big issues is startups frequently premature scale, meaning thinking they have product market fit when they don't. And so measuring it accurately is pretty important. We also think surveys like NPS and PMF surveys unfortunately suffer from sampling bias. And so they really struggle from accurately telling you whether you have it. So the 2 measures that we believe in are starting with one, retention, which is period over period retention curve. So you want to measure your retention of users basically seeing if they continue to perform the core action, and you want to see that retention curve flatten out. It turns out, oftentimes when you start out, you have a declining retention curve. And it takes work to get it to the point where it flattens out. When it flattens out, we basically believe you have some level of product market fit on the first dimension. Now, in the second dimension, the key thing here is growth. It turns out you want to have month over month sustainable user growth. And what we mean by that is you want to be adding more users next month than what you had this month, because a business that's not growing can't have product market fit. Now, the key thing about your question is, how does this differ on a per business model basis? Now, that's where the sustainable part comes in. I said you need sustainable new user growth. What do I mean by that? You can't just be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on Facebook ads and be growing faster month over month. That may not be sustainable unless you have sort of this sustainable test. And so in the program, we talk about a sustainability test depending on your growth channel. If you're doing paid ads, you need to have a reasonable payback period in which you're generating enough revenue from the cost of acquiring those users. Let's say you have a sales team that's selling your product. You need to have a certain sales efficiency, meaning that people are bringing in more revenue than the total cost of that sales team. And these are different tests that you can do to understand whether your user growth is in fact sustainable. And that ultimately helps you to understand whether you truly have that second measure around product market fit.
So if I just to sum that up, it sounds like at the foundations, we believe for most products or almost all products, there's sort of retention, growth, and the sustainability question, but that how you measure each of those has to differ depending on what your product is, how you go to market, and what you're selling. Is that right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So the nuance is in figuring out which ones of those it is. So it's not a science. There's a little bit of art to this and a little bit of science, like anything creative and exciting. Srijata, I hope I said your name correctly. You're next.
Yes, you did. Thank you. So once I've validated the pain, the customer segment, and the commercial, and my greatest risk is reach, how can I test it without spending hundreds of dollars already?
Yeah, so do you mean reach in terms of how do you acquire these users, or how big the market is?
How big the market is.
Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is really art and science of this whole process, right? The reason I say that is many of the most successful products we use today, if you quantify them at the time, had fairly small market opportunities, right? So let's just look at Slack. At the time, what was its market? Maybe HipChat and IRC users, and you combine that and it looks like a pretty small esoteric tool. And yet we know Slack ultimately created a market and expanded the market well beyond what existed at the time. Same for the tool I built, LinkedIn Sales Navigator. We were playing in this tool space called sales intelligence. We basically found about 30 million in annual spend in that space, which is nothing for the ambition of a company like LinkedIn. And now the product itself is doing $1 billion in annual sales. And so this is the tricky part. Like if you're measuring the market purely based on direct players in your space, it can be limiting because in fact, your product ultimately might create a market that's bigger than what you initially contemplated. Now, of course, on the other end of the equation, you still have this problem and maybe you just picked the wrong market. So PayPal is a great example of this, where their initial product helped you transfer money from Palm Pilot to Palm Pilot. It turned out that was too small of a market because Palm Pilots never took off. And Peter Thiel and team thought they would, but they didn't. And so this is the part where you have to not only look at how big the existing market is, how fast is that market growing, but does your product also enable new market entrants like Slack did, like Sales Navigator did, when there weren't other people doing that before? And you need to come up with a credible belief on, here are the people that we think are non-users that we can make users. And what you'd want to do then is test that hypothesis. Can you get some small subset of non-users to be users? And are there a lot of people that look like those non-users? And so those are some of the thinking that you'll have to go through to think about whether you are in a big enough market opportunity. But it is certainly non-trivial because of the fact that some of the biggest opportunities have been created from non-existent markets.
Yeah, having worked at Slack, I'll say there's sort of two ways you could look at that market, and both are wrong. One is this people who use chat to do work. So like, okay, that's pretty small, HipChat users, et cetera. We're swallowing a small market. The other side is everyone who works at a desk, like all information workers. Yes, that's the eventual maybe, but that doesn't give you any sequencing of how you actually grow into that large market. And so what's actually important is thinking, oh, our starting market is all startup and engineering teams at startups. Okay, that's interesting. How do we bridge that to engineering teams at larger companies? How do we bridge that to non-engineering teams at larger tech companies? How do we bridge that to non-tech companies? And so I think it's really about like, you have this big picture hypothesis of how the market that somebody puts on a slide, which is like all the people in the world, and then like where you're actually starting. And the hard part is about having an honest, real upfront understanding of what that sequencing is. I don't think it's just, oh, we'll wave our hands and figure it out later, which is what I think a lot of problematic lean approaches take, but is actually having a clear hypothesis about what each next step is or what 2 or 3 steps ahead might be. Sorry to jump in on you there, Satya, but that one feels like one I've thought a lot about and is important to me. So great. Sebastian, you're next.
Awesome. Thanks, Sachin and Reforge team for the content. It's amazing. By the way, the major problems of lean was a fantastic article. Completely agree with all of it. Anyway, so my question is more tactical. I would like for you to talk more about what this discovery techniques and validation techniques, like which ones, like where would you recommend us to find literature around this? Like, how do we learn how to better pick the right experiments for, whatever is it that we're trying to validate? I want to learn and expand my knowledge on like different techniques and like kind of create an encyclopedia of the available techniques and knowing when to use them. So any recommendations and pointers would be awesome.
Yeah, so
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead, Fareed.
No, I'm joking. I'm teeing you up.
Yep. So I think like the first technique that is important for every product builder to master is definitely doing customer interviews well, right? We all know we should start by talking to our customers. And so we talk about a very specific process called PMF interviews, product market fit interviews. There's many ways to ask your customer questions, but when you're in the earliest stages of finding product market fit, there's actually a prescriptive way of asking questions that can be helpful. I sort of introduced one sample question around your problem to solve, but in the program, we talk about each of the dimensions and how you can leverage customer interviews to ultimately help validate each dimension in that process. We then introduce other tools for the other validation techniques. So we talked about market research. Here's the thing about market research. You could just spend all day Googling and still not get into any interesting insights to validate your business. So instead, we talk about a tool called analogs and antilogs, which try to bring some action to this idea of doing market research. And so what you're trying to do is find analogs. What evidence is there in the market that supports each of my dimensions of my product strategy? And antilogs, which are like, what are things that don't support my hypothesis? So very quick example, iPhone is a great example. When iPhone was being introduced, Steve Jobs thought a lot about this. There's a lot of analogs he had. Walkman showed him that people wanted a personal music device. Napster showed him that people were willing to download music. So both of these are analogs. Now he had one major antilog. Would people pay for music? Actually, Napster was the antilog. No one wanted to pay for music. And so he spent a lot of his time identifying that as his riskiest assumption and then coming up with this entire process of convincing the labels to charge only 99 cents for their songs in order to sort of get over this hurdle he perceived in the market. And so, in the program, we talk about each validation technique and some of the tools you can use to do them well on the most common techniques that we've come across for validation.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're doing two things here. We're talking a lot about these concepts and trying to help y'all with your product market fit journeys. But also at the end of the day, we're building a program around this 4-week cohort-based program. It's going to launch in October, where we dive deep on all of these different things. And we have spent hundreds of hours talking to people who have built actual successful and unsuccessful products in market to try to understand what is important and what are the common patterns that great product builders do across these different things. So I think the easiest answer is take the program, but we hope that you've gotten a lot out of this call, even if you decide not to. So let's move on to the next one. Adriana, you're.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for today's talk, Sachin and everyone at Reforge. So my question is around intuition. We know that Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein, and many bright minds in history, they do believe that intuition was part of the reason why they succeed with their ideas. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts? When should we listen to this inner voice, and how to balance all the science of validation and all the techniques you've been sharing with our intuition? Thank you.
It's a fantastic question. And, one of the things I talk a lot about is there's different kinds of product managers out there, right? I sort of simplify it to builders, tuners, and innovators. Builders are the ones that are sort of building new features for an existing product. Tuners are the ones that are trying to get people to that value quicker through things like growth and optimization. And then finally, innovators are the ones that are responsible for going from 0 to 1 on a brand new product. And the key thing is that the skill set differs depending on which role you have as a PM. And so this product intuition is probably the biggest, most important one when it comes to being an innovator, because you're in a low data environment, right? So you can't, for example, just run an A/B test with the millions of users we had at LinkedIn, and then from that know tomorrow whether our product idea was good or not, right? And so, for example, for like a tuner, you can leverage analytical rigor to get the right answer, but as an innovator, you can't. And so it definitely is the case that you have to rely more on your product intuition. And that comes both in terms of your overall product strategy, but then also when you're making day-to-day product decisions, right? You just have to get something out there in the absence of users and data to iterate, and you need to do so quickly. So you need to leverage a lot of your own intuition on what the right product experience is to get out there for that initial rev. And so it has to be very intuition driven. Now, what I like to think about is, how do you leverage your intuition to initially come up with insights? And then how do you confirm those insights through validation, right? And so the part where I think people take lean to an extreme is they expect the customer discovery is going to help them come up with a good startup idea, right? When in fact, you want to leverage your intuition to come up with that compelling strategy, and then simply use validation to validate it. So I think that's the bar to think about. You should trust your intuition, but then you should validate it. And of course, you're going to have naysayers, right? Like, this isn't something where you're trying to get 9 out of 9 customers to want your product. That's never going to happen, because otherwise someone else would have built it. You're going to have naysayers, but you want to find proof points and evidence in the market that suggest what your intuition is valuable to the market.
All right. I promised I would leave myself 8 minutes for our close up, but I'm going to take one more, if it's fast, question from Jamal. Go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
Awesome. I'll make this quick. So my question is very specific to geographically constrained marketplaces. So if you start in a very small region and you're trying to scale it out, you might find product market fit in that area, but once you move out, there might be some different needs in the customers in that place. So my question is, where do you pick up on the product market fit process?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you can actually generalize it not only to a geographic constraint, but actually this idea is very applicable to many people in that you have an initial traction in one market, you have adjacent target audiences that you want to go after, and you're thinking about when do you take them on and what you'll need to do to take them on. And so oftentimes it's really important to be very clear about who your bullseye is, continue to build value for them, identify those adjacent customer segments, start experimenting and testing with them to figure out what their unique needs would be to ultimately determine how you can win that market as well. And actually, you're going to get to like a flattened retention curve on a per customer segment basis, right? And so you then want to take that new customer segment on, build capabilities that allow you to do so, and see if you can again achieve product market fit for that adjacent audience that you're going after. And so I think that's important for anyone who's thinking about how do you do this well, whether in a geo or not.
Awesome. So I think we'll wrap there. I'm really sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions. I tried my best to do so. But if you're excited about this program, you're interested in these concepts, we're going to go deep on this 4 whole weeks, focusing on these different steps and digging deep on this in a community of hundreds of other great product innovators who are building products like this. We believe that this program is built not just for product managers, but anyone building new products, whether you're even if you're on a brand new team, you want to know and build your intuition and understanding of how to validate these products. This is just one of many programs we have offered here in the fall of the Reforge cohort across topics like growth, product management, engineering, and marketing, including new programs around brand marketing, marketing leadership, and this one, the Finding Product Market Fit program. If you have any questions about this or any other program that we didn't get to, please feel free to email hello@reforge.com. We will do our best to respond to you. That can be questions about how the program works, Reforge overall, what the membership is, or specific questions about this program. We will do our best to answer them. I really appreciate all of your awesome engagement and amazing questions today. This has been super fun for me. I've learned something. I hope you have as well. And we look forward to seeing at least some of you in our programs upcoming this fall and in the future. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sachin.
Thank you. Great to be with you guys today.
Thank you. It was wonderful.